A little over 200 years ago, England was engaged in a titanic struggle against Napoleon, and 3 farm boys from Smarden volunteered to fight the French. One fought in 4 of the bloodiest battles of the war, before being invalided home. 2 became Chelsea pensioners, and one of these became a national hero, 65 years later. This is their story. Before joining up, James Underdown, Benjamin Bumpstead and James Newenden worked as farm labourers in Smarden at a time when employment in the cloth trade had, after 500 years, all but disappeared. Farmers were struggling, and the parish was paying out record subsidies to support its poor. For men such as our 3, the army offered food, drink, a cash bounty for signing on, and without doubt more excitement than life on the farm. Unfortunately, things did not turn out well for any of them. All 3 returned broken men, suffering the effects of wounds and disease. Approximately 745,000 men fought for Britain between 1792 and 1815. And perhaps surprisingly, the Napoleonic Wars killed a higher percentage of England's population than World War I would a century later. For Britain, the Navy was, and remains, the senior service. It rarely saw defeat and was well armed and supplied. In addition, a man could gain promotion on merit, and prize money could be huge. One crew received the equivalent of 10 years' pay after capturing a Spanish ship, and a captain received £40,000, which is over £1 million in today's money. In contrast, the army was small, and its woeful performance in the American wars and later in Flanders meant that it was not seen as an attractive prospect for recruits. Press gangs had already taken men from Smarden, and the tricks of the recruiting sergeants are well known. When one gave a gullible boy a shilling to buy him tobacco from a nearby shop, the lad took the money. The sergeant grabbed him and told him he had taken the king's shilling and was now in the army. Luckily, the boy's cries brought an angry mob, who threw the sergeant into a nearby pond. The British Army was professional, so inevitably it included the lowest strata of society, the scum of the earth, as the Duke of Wellington called them. He did, however, go on to describe his soldiers as fine fellows once they had been trained. British troops were trained for a minimum of 6 months, compared to 2 to 3 weeks in the French army. One result of this was that the British could fire a minimum of 3 rounds a minute, and some of the very best 5, compared to the French standard of 2 to 3. Another difference was that the British would form up in a line, which produced devastating firepower, about 1,000 to 1,500 bullets per minute. But 18 months after Waterloo, 300,000 men were dismissed from the services, without pension or acknowledgement. The war against Napoleon had exacted a huge price from these men. No land fit for heroes then either. Interestingly, the national debt ballooned to 200% of GDP, which is about twice our current virus-impacted borrowing level. Napoleon referred to it as a poisoned dart left in England's vitals. That's the background, so let's go back to our Smarden lads' stories. James Newenden was the first to sign up in 1807. This is his mark. He was 28 years old when he enlisted in the East Kent Regiment known as the Buffs. He was 5 feet 5½ inches in height, with brown hair, hazel eyes, and a fresh complexion. The following year, his regiment suffered the horrors of a 200-mile freezing midwinter retreat in a starving army dressed in tattered uniforms, many in bare feet, across snow-covered Spanish mountains, to be evacuated by the Navy at Corunna. This was Britain's original Dunkirk, the soldiers being taken off under enemy fire. The Buffs had been part of the rear guard during this desperate retreat, with the French army all the time pressing at their heels. When they arrived back in England, they were described as 70 barefoot scarecrows. Of all three, Newenden saw the most fighting in some of the bloodiest battles. In one, there were only 85 men left uninjured in his battalion, out of more than 500. But he was paying a heavy price, his body slowly being worn down by disease. Finally, still suffering from fever, he enlisted in a veteran battalion in the hope of extending his career on less arduous service. But his health had been ruined, and after just 15 days in his new regiment, he was discharged from the army, a visceral disease from ague and fever in Portugal. James Underdown and Ben Bumpstead enlisted the year after their friend Newenden had returned home, and we could imagine Newenden telling tales of battles in Portugal and Spain to spellbound farm boys in the Chequers Inn. James Underdown, at the age of 33, joined his regiment in 1813, and quickly found himself in the south of France, where the army was besieging the town of Bayonne. This was the final action of the 6-year Peninsular War, in which Underdown was wounded in the right hand. He tried to soldier on, and just as his friend Newenden had done, he joined the veteran battalion. But he was not fit enough, and was discharged 10 months later. His injury not only finished his army career, but meant he was unable to return to labouring in Smarden. In 1820, still a relatively young man, we find him living in Chatham as an out-pensioner of the Royal Hospital at Chelsea, receiving an allowance of 9d per day. We last hear of him on the 9th of May that year, when he was transferred to Canterbury, and is recorded as receiving 3 shillings. The army allowed him 3 days to make the 25-mile from Chatham to Canterbury, quite a generous time allowance, but he may have been marching together with other invalids. 3 months after James Underdown joined up, Benjamin Bumstead, destined to be a Victorian hero, enlisted at the age of 16. His is perhaps the saddest story of all. He was at the Battle of Waterloo, where his regiment formed into a square, and was charged by French cavalry 11 times, but remained unbroken. Afterwards his regiment was sent to Sri Lanka, where he was discharged in 1820 as being unfit for service. By 1841 he is back in Kent, married to Jane and working as a labourer. They had 2 children together, and then she left and moved in with a William Edwards and had children by him. In 1871 we find Bumstead in the Hollingbourne workhouse. 10 years on, and he is now a pensioner at the Royal Chelsea Hospital. There he had 2 years' service deducted from his pension for enlisting at 16, but 2 years were added back on for his service that day at Waterloo. His picture hangs today in the Hospital Museum and shows him still alive and seemingly well 65 years after Waterloo, together with 5 other veterans of the battle. Bumstead sits in the middle of the front row, aged 82, suddenly famous in his old age. The photograph, which is attributed to Charles Hincksman, was purchased by Queen Victoria, who was interested in both the Royal Hospital and the Napoleonic Wars. The photograph was taken just before Waterloo Day 1880 and was published by the London Stereoscopic Company to meet the public interest in the dwindling numbers of veterans. By 1880 only 14 officers were left, and that number fell to 7 by 1885. In Smarden, the family name Underdown is still with us, likewise the place name Newenden. As for Benjamin Bumstead, he died 2 years after the photograph was taken. He was the last Smarden veteran, and the one with a face we can put to his name.